I don't choose these stories. They find me. Listen carefully. There are places in the world where sound doesn't behave as it should, where distance lies, and the air itself seems to participate in the deception. Sometimes, what you hear far away is already standing beside you. I didn't go to the Venezuelan Llanos because of a tourist pamphlet or a documentary or a ghost story told around a bar table. I went because of a man who hated superstition and yet refused to joke about one particular whistle. He was an American industrial machinery salesman, the kind of pragmatic person who spent his life traveling between oil fields, cattle operations, and industrial sites, places where things either worked or they didn't, and where stories weren't supposed to matter. He told me that in some remote regions of Venezuela, the locals didn't talk about El Bone as a legend. They treated it more like weather. You didn't argue with it. You just adapted. There were rules about the plains at night, rules they followed without discussion, the way you don't debate gravity. Years later, that conversation stayed with me like a splinter in the back of my mind. I'd worked on enough so-called hauntings to recognize when people embellished. There was no embellishment in his voice, only the quiet discomfort of someone who'd seen others take something very seriously and decided he would too. So I went to the Llanos, not to prove anything, just to listen. The settlement where I stayed wasn't a town in the formal sense. A few scattered houses, a small store that sold gasoline and reused soda bottles, a chapel that seemed both abandoned and maintained at the same time. Beyond that, nothing but grass, scattered trees, and sky. When I asked about El Bone, people didn't smile or lean in theatrically. They didn't tell me tragic backstories or long embellished versions. They just gave me instructions. If you must go out there, one man said, no light. Don't talk. Don't answer whistles. Stay alone. And don't try to be brave. Brave people die stupid here. Then he changed the topic to cattle prices, as if we'd been talking about the weather after all. I began returning to the plains night after night, without a fixed plan. Sometimes I stayed an hour, sometimes longer. I wasn't waiting for anything specific, just for moving variables. No artificial light once I reached my spot. No music, no talking, and no leaving early simply because nothing seemed to be happening. If the plains reacted to presence rather than intention, I wanted to be there long enough to notice. The first night, the plains felt indifferent. Crickets, insects, the occasional mosquito whining near my ear. A faint, low bellow from distant cattle drifted across the darkness. The sky was so large it made the ground feel like an afterthought. On the second and third nights, boredom settled in. My eyes adjusted to the dark just enough to make out the silhouettes of trees and small elevations in the terrain. My mind did what minds do in silence. It started to fill the void with half-formed shapes and ideas. I wrote field notes by feel, careful not to use any visible light. By the fifth night, fatigue mingled with the waiting. Patterns of sound became familiar. Wind sliding over grass, the irregular clicks of insects, the night sounds far away. Nothing felt paranormal, just vast, ecological indifference. Still, there was something about the way the wind moved that bothered me. Some nights it carried sound clearly from kilometers away. Others it swallowed noise entirely, leaving the world muffled, like being inside a giant cupped hand. I'd encountered strange sound behavior before, in mountains, forests, even along certain coasts. It never felt accidental. By the ninth night, I had nothing to show except pages of meticulous notes and the creeping embarrassment of having asked people to take my interest seriously. I was ready to admit that the only thing I'd confirmed was that humans are very good at convincing themselves that silence holds meaning. But professional stubbornness is sometimes mistaken for courage. I gave myself one more night. I told myself it was for the sake of completeness. of finishing what I'd started. In truth, I didn't want to leave without at least one anomaly. The 10th night felt different almost immediately. Not spectacular, not cinematic, just emptier. The insects were there at first, then seemed to fade, as if someone had slowly turned down a dial I couldn't see. The cattle sounds, usually scattered, were absent. The wind, which had been a constant companion all week, thinned to a weak, intermittent breath. I sat down in my usual spot, same patch of slightly elevated ground, same line of sight to the distant tree line. I closed my eyes and focused on the sound field. That's what I call it when I try to map a place by ear rather than sight. At first, there was nothing remarkable, just my own breathing, the faint rustle of grass. Then I heard it, a whistle, spooky musical, not casual, several notes, spaced with deliberate intervals. Far away, very far away, somewhere beyond the tree line, where the land turned to a darker shade of night. I waited. The wind did not carry it again immediately. For a minute, I wondered if I'd misheard it. Some bird, some human, some odd echo of machinery. Then it came again. This time, it sounded closer, but the spatial information was wrong. If you've ever stood near a train track or a highway, you know how distance has a certain texture and sound. This whistle violated that texture. It felt both close and displaced, as if it were coming from a point that didn't fully exist in the landscape. I told myself it could be atmospheric anomalies, temperature layers refracting sound, the way radio signals sometimes travel farther at night. I know those explanations well. I've used them to soothe people before. The whistle song came a third time. Now it sounded faint, as if receding, except every instinct I had told me the source was closer. Far when near, near when far, the exact pattern the locals had described. In the flat, uninterested tone people reserve for warnings they know will be ignored. I reached for the small audio recorder hanging at my chest. No lights, no screen glow, just a mechanical switch I could slide by feel. I activated it. At the same time, I picked up my camera, preset it to long exposure, and aimed blindly toward where the sound seemed least plausible. The fourth whistling wasn't just sound. It came with the unmistakable sensation that something had changed position between one breath and the next. Not footsteps, not the progression of an approaching body through grass. More like reappearance, as if whatever produced the sound had altered its coordinates without bothering with the transition in between. At the edge of my vision, in a gap between two low shrubs, I saw a vertical shape that wasn't there before. Tall, thin, wrong in proportion. The moonlight barely caught it, but there was enough contrast to see that it was standing, not on four limbs, but two. I took a photo, then another. My heart was hammering, but my training did what panic couldn't replace. Document, don't run. At least not yet. The fifth whistle came from my left. I hadn't heard anything move. The plains were open. There were no structures, no cluster of trees thick enough to hide something large. And yet the sound was now off axis, from a point I would have sworn was empty a moment earlier. That was when my rational curiosity finally gave way to something simpler. Get out. I stood up, trying not to break into a run immediately. The path back toward the settlement felt longer than usual. The houses smaller, their tiny, distant lights suddenly meaningful in a way they hadn't been all week. I had prearranged with a moto taxi driver to be on standby nearby in case I needed a quick return or had equipment to move. I reached the meeting point, breath tight, and waved him over. He started the engine, but before we left, the whistle sounded again, closer than it had ever been. The driver froze. Then, very quietly, he crossed himself. He didn't ask what it was. He didn't pretend not to hear. He simply accelerated toward the settlement as fast as the battered vehicle could handle, keeping his eyes fixed on the road and refusing to look back. I looked back once and saw it crossing the open ground with a speed that didn't match its clumsy, uneven motion, its limbs moving out of sequence as it closed the distance far faster than something built like that should have been able to run. Midway through the ride, the whistle cut off abruptly, like a recording stopped mid-note. No fade out, no gradual distance, just absence, as if whatever owned that sound had reached the invisible border of human territory and lost interest. I didn't sleep that night. I listened to the recording instead. On first playback, it sounded almost simple, a whistle repeated at intervals, drifting in apparent distance. The kind of thing skeptics could reduce to a prank, a distant herder, a strange bird. I almost wanted to let it be that. But habit is a dangerous thing. I ran the audio through a basic analysis later, once I had my laptop and some privacy. I've seen a lot of strange spectrograms in my life. This one wasn't the most dramatic, but it was disciplined. The whistle wasn't a single clean tone. It was a sequence of 8 notes, each one carrying 2 overlapping frequencies. One in a normal human audible range, the other riding just above it, creeping into near ultrasonic territory. The lower components behaved the way sound should. The upper ones did not. In certain temperature conditions, sound can bend. You can get refraction, reflection, strange distance effects. But this didn't just bend. It stepped between bursts. The higher frequency appeared to shift in space in ways that suggested, if I were to believe the data, that the source was not traveling smoothly along the ground. It reminded me of something I'd seen before, years earlier, in a different country, in an entirely different case. A forest where voices called from directions that didn't match their apparent distance, and where an unknown animal seemed able to project its call sideways, as if it were throwing sound like a stone. I didn't draw conclusions. I just noted the similarity. Pattern is its own kind of evidence. The next morning, I went back to the spot in the plains, not to provoke, but to observe. The ground was moist, still holding the memory of recent humidity. If something large had been moving nearby, it should have left prints. I found them. Not many. A sequence, a suggestion of bipedal movement, spaced in a way that resembled a human gait. But the contact points were wrong. The soil showed disturbances where something had touched, but not with the weight distribution of a foot. More like brief, incomplete contact, as if an object had probed the ground without committing to standing on it fully. Back home, weeks later, I started going through the photos I'd taken during those seconds of panic. Most were useless, smeared lines of stars and grass. But in one frame, a silhouette appeared between 2 shrubs. Tall, out of proportion, limbs too long for the torso, joints slightly displaced from where they should be if they belonged to something human. When I overlaid that silhouette with certain biological models I'd seen referenced in old crash recovery files and unclassified sketches, things never meant for public circulation, the resemblance was troubling. Not identical, nothing ever is, but close enough to sit in the back of my mind like a weight. I'm not saying El Sealbone is a ghost, or an alien, or anything that fits comfortably into a single category. What I'm saying is that something out there produced sound with intention and structure, and the tools we use to study normal animals found the pattern, but not the species. The locals told a story about a cursed soul known as El Sealbone, the Whistler, in Venezuelan folklore. He is said to be the restless spirit of a man who murdered his father and was condemned to wander the plains forever, carrying a bag filled with bones and announcing himself with a long, haunting whistle that shifts unpredictably in distance. It's a legend old enough to have grown moss on its own variations. But legends are often the first draft of field observations. People witness something they can't categorize, and they give it a name. Over time, the name acquires a story, and the story acquires morality. Don't stay out late. Don't answer. Don't provoke what you don't understand. What unsettles me most is not that I heard the whistle. It's that I've heard its structure before, in forests, in mountains, in places that have nothing to do with Venezuela, where people gave different names to something that behaved in eerily similar ways. Far when near, near when far, no clean footsteps, avoids populated areas, appears in cultures that have never communicated, yet teach the same rules. Don't answer, don't whistle back, don't follow the sound. We like to think folklore and science live in different rooms. But sometimes, if you stand in the hallway between them long enough, you start to hear the same whistle echoing from both sides. I don't know what walks the Venezuelan plains at night. I don't know if it's alone or part of something older, a lineage that predates our stories and simply tolerates them, the way an animal tolerates the scratching of insects on its skin. But when I think of El Seal Bone, I don't picture a man dragging a bag of bones. I picture an organism, or something close enough to one, that learned long ago how to bend sound, to confuse distance, to use our ears against us. And then I remember how many centuries people have been telling others not to stand alone in the open at night, listening too hard. So I'm left with two questions I can't quite shake. Did villagers invent the legend to describe the entity? Or did the entity encourage the legend so we would behave the way it prefers? And if something has been crossing our stories for 400 years or more, adapting to new names and new fears, what exactly is it waiting for?